further ado, let's just get started with the first panel on dealing with debt, Chinese loan repayment strategies. Many African and Latin American countries are hitting peak repayment on Chinese loans just as domestic fiscal space narrows and global rates remain high. Chinese loan volumes have slowed, but renegotiations, restructurings, and ad hoc relief are accelerating, especially in frontier African and Latin American and Caribbean markets. This panel will bring together financial officials, researchers, and practitioners to examine what has worked and failed in recent restructurings with China and other creditors, how to increase transparency and domestic accountability, and how Africa and Latin America and the Caribbean can coordinate positions in their negotiations. To share their knowledge with us today will be Principal de Sola, Executive Director of the Andres Bello Foundation, Margaret Myers, who is the Managing Director of the Institute of America, China, and the Future of Global Affairs at Johns Hopkins SAIS, Ricardo Lehrmont of Binghamton University and Howard University, Trevor Lowery, who's an economist at Development Reimagined, and the moderator will be Dr. Joshua Eisenman, Professor of Politics at the University of Notre Dame. So please come to the stage. Welcome to have you.
In one of these corners. Okay, great. See somebody? Leland, are we short?
I'm online.
Fine, great. Okay, so I think I have to probably turn this on, right? All right. That's it. Hello? Got me? Great. All right, well, I'm Joshua Eisenman. It's a pleasure to be here with this august panel and Trevor online. So why don't we jump right in? Okay, we are at SAIS, right? My alma mater, happy to say, although it was a different building at the time. And if we go back about 10 years ago, we had a discussion about debt. And the discussion can be broken down generally between two camps, and it's more complicated, but you had the debt trap narrative, right, which was being promoted by various critics of China and its approach, which said the day of repayment will come. This is, we're making hay while the sun is shining. And then you had a different approach. One could call it the dragon's gift, right, where this was this largesse was out of the goodness of China's heart and intended to build the global South, and in my opinion was very much in tune with the narrative that Beijing was putting out at the time. So here we are 10 years later. Which of these narratives would you say has weathered most best in history? I'm sure it's a mixed bag, and I'm expecting that, but I wonder if you can take a look at what we've seen over the last 10 years, where we are, and give us your assessments. Perhaps we can start here, okay. Dr. Lehrmont.
Well, I'm just looking at one particular case, which is Morocco. Can you hear me? I've chosen not to look at continental Africa, but rather focus on a specific case to understand how this case can stand as an outlier, an example, or how to negotiate with the Chinese. Morocco is an outlier, and it is a conscious outlier with a policy formulated by the Royal Court and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Ministry of Finance that is extremely focused and conscious of the cost of debt. They have undertaken debt, but they've undertaken debt in a complicated investment or debt portfolio involving multilateral banks and also involving bilateral banks, but engaged in an approach to power in a multipolar world that is conscious that it is a small power. And the question then for the Moroccans is, how do we exercise maximal force as a small power. We are a small power. How do we punch higher than our weight? What is our strategy? How much debt to undertake? With whom should we undertake debt? And what has been fascinating about the Moroccan case is the level of sophistication with regard to who their investment partners may be. They are not highly reliant upon China, given their long-standing relationships with Europe and with their proximity to Europe. The competitive advantage that Morocco has in the global economic system is its proximity to Europe, which positions it as Mexico could be positioned with regard to the United States, in the sense that it has lower labor costs like Mexico and proximity to a key market. In the case of Mexico, it'd be the United States. In the case of Morocco, it is Europe. So the Royal House and the Ministry of Finance made a calculated assessment about 20 years ago about how is it that we're going to position the country to maximize its leverage in the world system. And it's taken advantage of its geographical proximity to Europe. That is, that Tangiers is 14 kilometers from Spain, to create an advantage in the world system that positions it really in 3 areas. And that is ports, logistics, and data. We'll talk about data later. But what they've astutely come to understand is because of their geographical position, they are part of a world logistics system that involves not only Tangiers, but involves the port of Piraeus, and involves Ethiopia, and involves other key logistical areas in proximity to Europe. And recognizing that they are a key player in that, they've decided to take a course of the development that's clear contradistinction, for example, with the Greeks in Piraeus, which basically gave the whole port to China. What we've learned from the Moroccan experience is that they've maintained their sovereignty over the port of Tangiers. So from a Moroccan perspective, in terms of industrial and economic development, what is clear is that how they want to position themselves in the world system is to have competitive strength in Tangiers as a port and as a logistical hub, which then leverages their industrial capacity, which is primarily focused on automobiles and avionics, and more recently, in more recent years, the last 2 years, with Gotian, which is electric batteries with the Chinese. That's going to be the next wave. So the point that I'm trying to make here in terms of having this conversation about debt is that the Moroccans, I think, were astutely able to understand the risks of debt as it had been undertaken, for example, by the Ethiopians, and decided not to go down that route. And what they've done is they've taken a page from East Asian foreign policy playbook, which is Singapore, which is a hedging strategy, which is to keep the French, the Spanish, less importantly, the Americans, and now more increasingly the Chinese, at a distance, and playing off the various investors against each other to their advantage, all the while keeping a state focus on control of what is known as the crown jewels, The two crown jewels are the port and the Mohammed VI industrial city. Governmental control of those two crown jewels is the key asset or key focus of the regime in terms of their industrial and multipolar power strategy. This doesn't address the other part of economic development in Morocco, which necessarily involves agriculture, but I'm not speaking to that at that moment because that's a different question. But in terms of industrial policy and in terms of positioning itself in the global system, they are aware of the dangers of debt. They've undertaken debt with the Chinese, especially with regard to transportation infrastructure in the areas of highways and in the areas of trains, but they have avoided dealing with the Chinese and incurring debt, keeping that portfolio maybe at a approximate maximum of about 40% of the entire debt portfolio. So that is how I would contribute to this conversation. My brain is not too big, it's not big enough to think about all of Africa. I just would like to think about Morocco and then think about how Morocco has been able to distinguish itself and leverage its position geographically to its advantage. I mean, there are other conversations we could have in another forum about what Morocco did in contrast to Algeria, which has a different strategy, or Morocco did or could do in contrast to Libya. But I think of analysts of the world systems, there's a particular advantage in terms of thinking about how small states exercise their power, to look at how small states like Morocco, like Rwanda, like Qatar, like Singapore, exercise power despite their small size.
You know, it's fascinating for me to hear this because the book project I'm now working on is doing exactly that. I was in Morocco in May. I was in Singapore in July. Czechia, Colombia. So it's amazing to hear you say this. I'm feeling very validated here. But the question I kept asking myself as I walked through a bot is how much of this is replicable? Because it's all very nice to say we have 7 different partners, let's choose the best. But what if you only have one? Or you only have one and it's not that good and the choice is no railway or the expensive railway that you don't want. And maybe I'll let you percolate on that because I want to go down the line here and see if Parzival, what do you think? Are we in the debt trap world? Are we on the dragon's gift world or somewhere in between? And how do you make sense of it?
Yeah, well, you just gave me a lot to think about. I was thinking about saying something else, but I'm gonna throw that away. And especially, I'm from Venezuela, and my area of expertise lies on the China and Venezuela relationship. And well, given everything that's happened in the last month, I think we cannot not talk about it. But I will spring from a lot of your comments. I think that set of questions that you presented on the Moroccan case 10, 15 years ago were also present in the Venezuelan case. Very favorable geopolitical position, a petrostate, so key asset. You mentioned governmental control of crown jewels. Venezuela, it's state-owned enterprise. PDVSA is definitely the golden goose. So they did ask the same question. How do we leverage our geopolitical positioning? The thing is, they came out with the complete opposite answers to the case of Morocco. Definitely not aware, or I would even go as far as say complete ignorance of the importance and risks of debt as I'm sure most of you in the audience know, Venezuela still to this day is the largest loan portfolio that China has had on a world stage, even more than countries that have way more geopolitical importance to China, like Pakistan. And why do I say they arrived at a complete opposite conclusion? You mentioned in the case of Morocco, leverage, see how many partners you have, leverage them, try to negotiate. In the case of Venezuela, the complete opposite was done. It was from the get-go a policy that evolved over time, basically to cut relations with key Western financial institutions, increasingly get into greater tensions with the United States, promoting a regional umbrella precisely to promote interests of foreign powers, in this case, China, excluding the United States. I'm guessing it's pretty obvious who made the right decision if we were going to do a comparative analysis between the Moroccan and the Venezuelan case. It's inevitable in this conversation not to talk about institutions. We're not going to dig into the reasons why this happened, but the matter of the fact is that Venezuela's institutional capacity to deal at the international level and leverage its own, small middle power vantage point. They simply didn't exist, or what did exist from previous decades was completely torn down because of political, ideological reasons. And circling back to your question, Josh, I wouldn't. I think that's the wrong framing, to put it between these two poles of whether China becoming this financial savior, or the so-called narrative about debt trap, which I think has been academically completely deconstructed, and it's just basically false. Even in an extreme case like Venezuela, and I think it has a lot more to do with internal decision making and strength about institutions, rule of law, and a lot of other domestic variables that take precedence over, China's willingness to extend these large loans. And then you have the context, even again, in the most extreme case that we have, an outlier case in China-Latin America relations, like Venezuela, $65 billion is really not significant when you look at the overall debt structure of the Venezuelan state, which is billions and billions and billions more. The money that it's a black box today. No one really knows how much Venezuela still owes China. The only thing we do know is that it never stopped paying. It's still paying. But it's after January 3rd, I think everything we've seen right now, even politics outside of it, on the economic side, the first, the first players arriving in Venezuela are bondholders, are a lot of, oil industries that were embargoed or that their assets were taken by the state. That would be I think that's the center of the conversation. And China is nowhere to be seen in this conversation about debt restructuring. I'm sure they're talking behind the scenes with the current people running the country. And they're probably trying to, understand what's going to happen with Chinese debt. But I have no doubt that it's pretty down on the line of priorities for the Venezuelan state at the moment.
Margaret, I want to turn to you and add on to this question because your expertise. If you could talk about those new and interesting financing vehicles that China is using in Latin America and how they contribute to this broader discussion.
Absolutely. So, and let me give just a couple thoughts on your first two questions and add on, as you suggested. So, I mean, I couldn't agree more with Parsival about sort of the limitations associated with these two sort of conceptualizations of Chinese finance in the region, at least undertaken, 10 to 15 years ago. We heard a lot about the debt trap narrative, right, which assumed that, take on the debt now, accept the finance now, but then 10, 15 years from now, you'll be burdened, right, with this problematic debt and unable to repay it. There was also another element to this, another layer to this was, at least among those who are very critical of China's approach, and that was a sort of intentionality, right? A sense that China was intentionally burdening countries with debt in order to later be able to seize or take some control over strategic assets. The other side of the coin is this sort of benevolent China, lending to the Latin American region, to Africa, to other parts of the world that in some cases were not able to access international credit markets in an effort to help them with their development agenda and to promote projects, especially infrastructure projects that others were not willing to finance, were able to finance at that particular moment in time. Neither of these, I think, fully told the story then, and certainly don't tell the story now, right? You have certainly countries, I think, that have found themselves in difficult debt situations, right? Those are in Latin America. It's inevitably fewer, I think, than what we see in other parts of the world, in part because 90% of the total finance went to 4 countries and a handful to other places, including in the Caribbean, right? And you also see countries still seeking out finance from China. But I think by and large, the interpretation of Chinese finance at that time and the interpretation of what China is doing now in terms of investment and trade that is also, in many ways, supported by financial mechanisms and platforms, is that it's largely pragmatic in nature and very much linked to China's own economic growth objectives, right? It's the same story that we were hearing 10 to 15, or that was motivating, I think, so much of what was happening 10 to 15 years ago. So what was China doing back then? If it wasn't just these two stories, what's the rest of the, how do we fill out the narrative? Well, I mean, so much of what China was looking to do was 3 things, right? And they're the same 3 things that we talk about when we talk about the going out strategy of the 1990s and the early 2000s. And it's the old story now, but I think it still largely applies. It's market seeking, right? Looking for new markets for Chinese goods, for Chinese services, which is now an imperative, right? It's resource seeking. And it's, internationalizing Chinese companies, making them exceedingly competitive in an environment where they may or may not already be. And so back then, the only way to do that was to give loans, big loans, often to governments, sovereign lending, right? Multi-billion-dollar loans, which were then conditioned on the use of that money for projects that were built by Chinese companies in many cases, right? And then also sometimes for the exportation of Chinese equipment in support of these construction projects. And so that helped Chinese companies to establish a presence in the region, to establish some degree of competitiveness, right? Help to export more in the way of Chinese equipment and technology and ability. At a moment in time when that was really quite difficult, given the limited experience and on-the-ground presence that China had in the region 15, 20 years ago. That's changed. But the story hasn't, right? China is still looking for the same things, right? Still looking for resources. Soy is still very much a fundamental part of this story, right? Agricultural commodities. Minerals are an even bigger part of this story, I would say, than they were, 15 years ago. Now we're talking about a wider range of minerals and metals, right? To include lithium and other critical minerals. We are talking about gold in a way that we haven't talked about. I mean, that's expanded considerably. A lot of these things, right? Still, this is a very big part of the story. Markets, Markets are absolutely fundamental. Chinese companies need to invest, they need finance to invest, and they need to invest in many cases to promote trade, to encourage more in the way of exportation, which at this point is fundamental for China. Offloading, capacity in these sectors that are that China's prioritized at home, but that have, as a result of Chinese industrial policy, become, in some cases inefficient, and in other cases, competing to such a degree that there's extensive overcapacity, excess capacity that needs to be offloaded, on whether to Latin America or wide-ranging other parts of the world. And so the same things are driving this, right? And the thing that's changed is that China has, and I think Latin American countries and other countries have reconsidered what it is to engage with China and how these various drivers, initiatives, interests ought to be promoted. So what you see is a sort of reckoning with the model that was implemented 10, 15, 20 years ago by China Development Bank mostly, but by other banks too, China Exim Bank and some of the commercial banks, which caused some problems, as we've seen, right? It's been a challenge for Venezuela, it's been a challenge for other countries. Chinese banks themselves are debt laden and are grappling with these ongoing negotiations and efforts to restructure or not, right, certain tranches of this debt and to manage the situation, which has grown immensely over time and is now something that they're having to grapple with. The areas of focus have also changed for China, right? We're not talking big infrastructure projects in the same way that we were in the past, right? These are smaller projects now that China is supporting. Small but beautiful was a term that I thought had kind of gone its way and wasn't being used anymore, and then it was resurrected in the 2025 policy paper on Latin America in a pretty central way. And so small and beautiful projects, right? So these short-term projects in sectors of specific interest to China as China looks to ensure that it can grow at even moderate rates in the coming years is something that China is really promoting. And so how do you achieve these things? And how do you achieve these things at a moment when Latin America too is thinking, okay, maybe we don't want to take on these large scale loans. Maybe we need to engage with China in other ways that are less promoting of potential long-term debt related challenges of the sort that Latin Americans also have with other lenders. And so what we're seeing now in terms of other mechanisms, other platforms, is a lot more reliance, not on the policy banks, and in fact, for those who track this, right, and at the American Dialogue, we track this very closely, but Chinese policy bank finance, we saw peak lending around 2010, 2011, right, when there were massive credit lines given to Venezuela, to Brazil, and a handful of other big loans, right, extended across the region, but it dropped off after 2015 in a really dramatic way. Now we see maybe $1 billion a year, maybe, right? Often to Brazil and maybe a smattering of other countries. That is not the story anymore. The story is one of smaller lending for specific projects, often coming from commercial banks who will lend to the companies themselves. The companies also, in many cases, bring their own financial arms, into the fold and are financing these projects in their own ways. Private equity has become part of this equation in a way that we haven't seen in previous decades, and it's really quite fundamental at this juncture, especially if we're talking about high-tech investment. And so the mechanisms for finance, right, are no longer the big loans that we all heard about 10 years ago, but a very, very different set of financing vehicles that are much harder to track, right, but are fundamental in promoting this new set of investments, right, and which are still very much aligned with the old objectives, right, but are being carried out in a wide range of new ways.
Great. Trevor, do you want to comment on this one? Good. Are you with us?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, yeah. Go ahead, and then I've got some follow-ups.
Okay, no, it's just repeat the question to make sure I'm on topic, please.
Okay. So the question, broadly speaking, is that about 10 years ago, there were two, I would say, dominant themes, which were people talking about a possible debt trap. And again, the debt trap narrative suggests a kind of like a desire to trap someone. And the question of is that a trap or is it a mistake, I think is open. But then a question about whether or not China was simply filling the gap, that other lenders were not lending to the global South, and that China out of, I wouldn't say the goodness of its heart, but the combination of political incentives and economic ones went forward in a way that was good for the global South. So how do you evaluate these two narratives 10 years on?
All right. Thank you, Prof, and for those enlightening remarks from all the foregoing panelists. My name is Trevor Luede. I'm an economist at Development Reimagined. We work across several work streams, and one of the work streams we have is China Africa. So a lot of my comments will be premised on that vantage point, or from that vantage point of the China Africa perspective. I think the debt trap narrative has been sufficiently debunked that it's perhaps surprising that it would still have currency to this day, to the extent that the claims that lending was intended to seize sovereign assets or to intentionally cripple countries fiscally. There's just no empirical evidence to that. And I think there's been a lot of good work that has been done by scholars, by journalists, all manner of stakeholders to debunk that misrepresentation of reality. Now, as to whether China was simply filling the gap, I think that makes for a more interesting discussion. There's a report that came out recently by the One Campaign about what they've called a great reversal over the last 5 years, that Chinese outflows from Africa have overtaken how much the Chinese are sending to Africa by about 22 billion over the last 5 years. And of course, while that is illuminating, the picture it paints is only partially true, because we must remember that what China was funding in the period over the last 2.5 decades really was stuff that multilaterals had pretty much neglected, in particular large-scale infrastructure projects. Of course, the literature on development was there. These are the enablers of development: electricity, roads, rail, but multilaterals were simply not funding. So here come the Chinese, who had a lot of excess cash on their hands and whatever other strategic objectives they had, and were willing to put money at this critical need for developing countries in Africa and across the global South. So to that extent, there is credence then, there's value to interpreting what we saw as the Chinese filling a gap that others had ignored. If you look at other development partners, at least with respect to Africa, and identify, for example, how much funding was going to infrastructure, it was almost non-existent. The World Bank in particular, or the European Union or OECD funders, a lot of funding was going into social sectors, as opposed to the drivers and enablers of development, as it were. And so from that perspective, China was filling a gap that others were ignoring. But it's also interesting that we're recasting that picture 10 years back, because I think a lot of the analysis that is coming out lately is either willfully or erroneously taking the analysis up until 2024, where we have, rightly so, seen a significant reduction in what China is funding and the ticket sizes of the projects that they're financing. But the recent data that has come out, 2025, on the BRI, for example, shows that the highest investments for BRI on record happened last year. And we've seen a diversity in the ticket sizes. For example, in Nigeria, you have a $24 billion project, the Green Republic Industrial Park, that the Chinese have put money on. You have the refurbishment of the Tanzania-Zambia Railway, Tazara, at 1.4 billion that the Chinese have put money on. Of course, that is amidst a milieu of other smaller ticket size projects that they're funding. But which is to say that as we intervene in this discussion, I think it's important to recognize that China had a long zero COVID policy that took until the end of 2023. So in many ways, that funding is still recovering. So when we take the time between maybe 2019, 2020 until 2023, which naturally we saw declines, and then pass judgment that indicates that China, pivoting in priorities, funding is drying up. That is, I think, a picture that is still emerging, to the extent that what 2025 has shown is that there's still a lot of room for recovery for what those outflows look like. And perhaps we can only tell maybe in a couple more years what has really been happening in the recent past with Chinese funding. And finally, just two comments on what preceded earlier. I think really with the issue of debt, there was comments on comparison between Morocco and Venezuela. I think an important factor that we must also pay attention to is what I refer to as the coincidence of strategic interests. I imagine that many other countries similar to Morocco have made an attempt to draw out long-term plans, vision this, vision that, but not many of them have had the kind of success that Morocco has had. And it wouldn't be fair, I think, to attribute all that to simply what the Moroccan state has done. Well, now there's the fact of the recognition of the strategic positioning that Morocco has. That positioning, has been there throughout history. But the reason it's starting to reap fruits now is that I think there's a coincidence of strategic interests between Morocco and major powers in the world that are finding it to be in their interest to work closely with Morocco, maybe on better terms than they would with other partners, and then that is reaping fruits for Morocco. So the point on the coincidence of strategic interests is absolutely important, because you can get it all right internally, but the external environment can remain absolutely hostile to you. But if there's that coincidence of strategic interests, a leadership that has its stuff together, an internal environment that is willing to put at the disposal of said country resources and networks and markets and technology, and all these things that enable transformation of the economy, then that gives us a fuller picture what is happening internally and what's happening externally. Yeah, let me leave it at that for now, and then maybe say a little more when we get into follow-up. Thank you.
Trevor, I just want to follow up quickly on one point. Is it your opinion as an economist that the BRI is about to have a resurgence then? That we're going to have the renaissance and that these lending numbers are going to go up again? And if so, are we looking at them again coming from Chinese state-owned banks as they did in the past? Or are these going to be different flows from different financing vehicles? So, I'm curious if you're seeing this upswing, especially amid a Chinese economy that's struggling, is that what you're expecting that we'll see this year and next?
So what we're seeing is that the dominance of the public sector, SOEs, policy banks within the new investments, especially for 2025, is declining. So about half of the BRI investments last year were from the private sector. The other half was from the public sector, which is a different profile from when the BRI had just started or over the course of its life over the past decade and a half or so. So we are seeing the Chinese private sector becoming more actively involved in the BRI. And I think part of that has been alluded to already by the previous speaker, that, as the Chinese economy figures itself out, tries to find a new equilibrium, folks are looking outward for new market opportunities to try and make whatever return they can elsewhere. But the public sector is also still playing an important role, accounting for the other half. But like I said, this picture is still forming because this upswing, again, is the highest on record over the lifetime of the BRI, but it's also coming on the back of what has been a slowdown in Chinese outflows over the past half a decade. And so I think it's a bit too early to say what it's going to look like or how it's going to settle eventually, but it's painting, at least as I see it, a picture of a resurgence that 2 years on after they've put an end to this zero COVID policy, folks are starting to settle in, folks are starting to go out, folks are starting to see new opportunities. As the geopolitical competition is heating up, those investments are starting to flow out more aggressively as they were earlier in the century. So I think we're going to see an increase. I don't know if the upswing the momentum is going to be as large as it was last year, but certainly the numbers are going to go higher than they were in the preceding 4 or 5 years.
Thanks. I have a follow-up here for Margaret, and it's based a little bit on what Trevor's saying. Every loan requires two sides, the lender and the borrower, right? And even if China is prepared to move forward with different vehicles and approaches, if the borrower is not ready to take on that level of debt or not in a position, then those loans won't be made anyway. So are you optimistic, or how do you see the recipient side of the equation? Even if China is ready, are they ready to receive more loans?
Yeah, I think that's a terrific question. I also want to, just one sentence to respond to the comments that were just made. I think this is a useful opportunity to kind of compare Latin America and Africa, right, and kind of what may or may not be happening in both regions. We do see that resurgence in BRI related investment, right, in the African context, but as it has been shown by studies, Christophe Nadeau-Poulon does his tracking of the BRI, and there, what he showed very clearly was that Latin America was not part of that story, right? We saw a continued decline in investment in terms of value, right, in Latin America, whereas in Africa, right, in other places, we saw some increase. That may be something that is just a one-year spike, or maybe indication of a shift in overall trends in those regions. But Latin America's story is still one of decline, at least in the numbers. What you do see is more deals. It's not that China's leaving, right? China's still there. It's just investing in smaller projects, right, that happen to be very well aligned with those sectors that China has identified as directly linked to its own economic growth objectives. So I'll leave it at that. So there are two sides to the story. We have to think very critically about what Latin America thinks about all of this and about these FDI projects, right, about trade, and then also about the financial equation. Those that have received massive amounts of finance, and really that's 4 countries, right, of the sovereign lending in the Latin American region. That's, Venezuela, most specifically, right, is the top recipient in Latin America and globally, right? Brazil, Argentina, and Ecuador. And those that have the most outstanding debt at this juncture, right, are still Venezuela. Again, the numbers are murky, right? The estimate is 8 to 10 billion at this juncture, somewhere in that ballpark, but who knows? Ecuador still has some debt outstanding. We'll be in the process of renegotiating that with China in the next year, I believe. There's some issue with, obviously there's the credit lines in Argentina, and there have been loans that have been taken on there, and they're in different phases of repayment. And then in Brazil, there is no real debt outstanding. Those credit lines that have been issued have either not been utilized or have been repaid. So those are the 4 sort of cases, and they're all dramatically different, right? And each of these countries has a different view of what it is to whether they ought to be engaging with China in the ways that they have in the past. On the Ecuador side, for a number of reasons, because of the results of some of the projects and also the debt that they're still dealing with, there is a sensitivity to continued engagement with China, especially in terms of financing. That doesn't mean that Ecuador is not welcoming of more in the way of investment in various forms, right? But this sort of loan story is one that I think still resonates in a somewhat negative way, right, with some of the population there, as do some of the projects, right, that were financed by these loans, which haven't always gone as planned. In other places, Argentina, for instance, these have been a sort of political battle or chip, right? In the political battle, you have projects where loan money is withdrawn, during one administration and refunded during another, and then back and forth, and they're paused and not paused, right? And so you've got this sort of very interesting. There's also a local level dynamic in Argentina where financing has been given to localities, to provinces specifically, and so that's a really unique aspect of that particular relationship. And so each one of these thinks of this differently. Where I think all probably agree is that this model of large scale sovereign lending is, and this is China too, right? This is not really what we're seeing anymore, even for the big BRI projects that may be happening in Africa. So China is neither issuing this, and indeed the policy banks have been drawn back. They're doing more at home than they are overseas. And so if there is new stuff, right, it's just not going to be coming through those mechanisms. It'll be coming through FDI channels, right, and financed in different ways, maybe from the policy banks, but directly to the companies themselves, maybe from the companies themselves, maybe through other arms, maybe through loans that are from a wide range of different financiers, right? Some of them might be Chinese, others might be coming, JP Morgan or others, right, that may be part of these loan offerings. And so, and then of course there are some that are coming through the large multilateral banks, sometimes the Chinese participation, including AIIB, for instance. So that's, I mean, that's one thing. I think the bigger question, this is not a panel, this is a panel on finance, so I'm not going to take it there, right? But I'll just say as a teaser, right, the bigger issue, I think, for Latin American countries, and this is probably going to, this extends certainly to Southeast Asia, even though we're not talking about that region specifically today, but, you know, the bigger question, I think we're at something of an inflection point in general about, you know, the Chinese model of engagement, especially in the Latin American region. There's been something of awakening to China's industrial policy and the implications of that for Latin America. And this especially resonates, I think, in the area of exports, where in some countries, especially those where there's a real industrial base, right, there is growing concern about competition, about, you know, the ability to survive. It's existential in certain cases, right? And certainly the steel industry has been complaining about this for upwards of a decade or not more, right? But there are new industries that are finding themselves unable to compete in really strategic ways. So we're going to see that in the, I think, head-to-head issues in the investment arena as well.
Great. Well, thank you, Margaret. Let me turn to you two gentlemen. And this is a question I can start with you if you feel comfortable answering. If not, we can take it on. But I think one thing we've certainly seen in the United States is the politicization of trade deficits. And that's in part one reason why we have the tariffs we do on Chinese goods. And as we look at the diversionary effects, the enhancing with $1.2 trillion in Chinese trade surplus last year, and we see a lot of diversionary effects into the global south, into Africa, Latin America, Southeast Asia. What are the long-term, if any, political effects of such long-term trade deficits? Are they something that China should be concerned about? Or are they simply, I suppose, the cost of doing business? Or is this a concern we should have at all? And I ask, guys, perhaps from the American perspective, watching these things become highly politicized, if we should expect places like Kenya and others that have 95%, Ethiopia, 95% of the trade going in one direction, that there will be a political chickens coming home to roost.
Well, I'm not a China expert, but there's an internal dynamic within China that requires large trade deficits. Simply to keep their domestic situation stable, it's fed by continuous growth. So I don't see how, given that internal logic, there are any incentives to reduce the trade deficit on their part voluntarily. Viewed historically, it would be like asking the United States in the 1890s to halt its economic growth in becoming a world power in the transition from Britain and Germany to the United States. To me, it's a historically uninformed question.
There are still, of course, consequences, right? So you may say that domestically China has its reasons, and I would agree. However, the consequences on the countries that are suffering these deficits are real.
Yes.
And while the question, if asked in terms of China, is clear, in terms of these countries who have to suffer with the consequences, I think it's worth discussing.
Well, then the answer that I'll give you is exactly the same historical response, which is the United States in the 1910s and 1920s didn't care, because it was bound to grow economically on its own terms to satisfy the requirements internally within the United States. And to ask the Chinese to behave or think differently, I think, at least from a historical perspective, is unreasonable.
Can
Yes,
I?
yourself.
From the Latin American side of the equation, and I agree with the historical assessment, but regardless of what happens in China, I agree with your assessment, Josh, about having political repercussions in these countries. And I think we are starting to see that. Whether these countries can do something about it, that's a different conversation. But take the case of Honduras recently. One of the key topics of the political campaigns was precisely the trade deficit with China. And this is something that I constantly think about, that to a large extent, with exceptions, with some candidates for political reasons or partisan reasons, China is still not seen as a domestic issue. Once that starts to change, like the specific case of Honduras, my bet would be that we'll start seeing more about the conversation about trade deficit with China, given the impact is gonna probably increase, because again, I don't think anything changing in China, at least in the short middle term. So this international forces are gonna be there, and countries, small middle powers are gonna have to deal with them. And I think increasingly that will become a topic of conversation. And if you track political campaigns, we're in a year, we're going to have relations in Colombia, presidential elections in Colombia, just a couple of months. This is the first time, and we've been tracking this for a while now, that China is part of the conversation. It's relegated to it's not as important as a lot of other issues, but it's starting. I think we're increasingly going to see this. And again, there's a lot of structural issues, because a lot of these deficits have also been historical with the United States. So we're going to see how that plays out.
If I could just add one thing.
And then I'll go to Trevor
And then,
from the Africa perspective.
Because I didn't fully answer your question. A hegemon can deal with this, can deal with the blowback. China is an emerging hegemon. I mean, we have to look at the world from, as Brodel would say, a longue durée. Where are we in 2025 in terms of the projection of future power? Barring a global economic crisis, it's clear that the United States is going to be eclipsed by China.
I'll take that bet.
And I'll take it as well.
You heard it.
Yeah, it will be. And given our disinvestment generally in universities, technology, research, we are at the beginning of a decline. The Chinese universities are sweeping up our intellectuals and academicians along with the Europeans. This is an inflection point, which could be reversed next year, but maybe not. But if things can continue as they are, barring a global economic crisis, given the trade figures that you just mentioned from last year, which are expected to continue, the power of the Chinese is going to increase, the power of America is going to decrease. And in this emerging new world order, the hegemon can deal with the blowback.
So much I want to say. However, sticking to the panel, and I don't want to forget Trevor because he's online, so it's easy to forget him. And I do want to hear the African perspective. Trevor, being an economist, works on Africa. I'd love to know what you're thinking when you're looking at these trade deficits. Some countries, many countries in Africa who are not exporting raw materials are high 90s in terms of trade deficits. And so I wonder, and I think this might be one reason we're seeing a move to the RMB in terms of some returning loans in RMB, and some payments, I think in Zambia, are being made to Chinese, or Chinese firms are being allowed to be paid and work in RMB. So Trevor, I wonder from the African perspective, are you concerned about these trade deficits, or do you see them as maybe the cost of doing business?
Absolutely. I think any reasonable leadership or observer or analyst would be concerned. No one sets out to be paying more than they're earning. Uh, uh, Before I forget, let me first comment on John's intervention, that in fact, the historical context of China and the US is different. The US did not grow with an export-oriented strategy primarily. That comes as a pivot in the late 1800s after domestic depression, when external markets become important. China, on the other hand, has predicated its growth on an export boom. And that distinction is important because the US was very much inward looking. Venturing outward came as like a strategy for survival, stabilizing, the domestic when things weren't proper. As for China, they've had this boom predicated on exports. And now that there needs to be some kind of rebalancing of their economy, there's a natural inclination for several reasons. And one of them being that the model that enabled the export boom, labor, resource extraction, is not where China kind of wants to stop. If you follow them closely, you would know that now they talk a lot about advancing and upgrading the productive forces. So moving into higher value products, higher value sectors, higher value economic activities, which basically means that the model of low-cost labor that drove exports may not necessarily work anymore. But as hostility builds up across major markets where the Chinese have been selling, you also then get concerned that, okay, we can't continue this way. We must now turn some of that external demand inward such that people domestically can also start to consume. I think consumption in China accounts for like 30% of their economy, which is significantly lower than other large economies in the world that are like 50 or 60%. So there is an incentive, an imperative, even for economic stability in China, for them to rebalance the economy, rethink the export-oriented. Exports will remain important, but maybe they will become less significant within the profile of the Chinese economy as we go along. Now, in the case of African countries, as part of that story, China has opened up its market to less developed countries in Africa and across the world, non-reciprocal, zero tariffs. Now these countries have to work out, how do you ramp up your production, add value at home, and then send high value products into the Chinese market that has been opened up to you. What we've seen in the past is that trade access, market access on its own is not sufficient. And this is not unique only to Africa. If you look at the experience of the so-called Asian tigers, for example, it wouldn't have been sufficient that the US or Europe opened their market to South Korea or Hong Kong or Taiwan without making corresponding investments in these countries to ramp up production. But what we've seen with many of these trade deals many a time, whether it is now with China or AGOA with the US or everything but arms with the EU, you open the market, but production capacity is still limited. And you can't trade anything if you're not producing anything of consequence, really, because production precedes trade. And high value production obviously precedes high value trade. So from the African perspective, it's not just the cost of doing business. We've seen the volumes of trade between China and Africa go up year on year. I think getting close to 400 billion as of 2025. But also the deficit is growing. Of course, with a lot of variation across different African countries, but the principle remaining the same, that for countries that are still heavily reliant on raw material exports, that are looking for revenues to fund huge fiscal gaps, domestic needs, it's like a survival imperative for them to have trade surpluses where they can. But that is predicated on on investment in productive capacity. And I think I can tie this to your previous question, Joshua, which was about the demand and supply of debt. For developing countries, especially in Africa, but really across the global south, the demand for debt isn't ever going to go down. The development needs are huge. But the key question is if that money can be directed into productive investments that make it possible for that debt to repay itself, so to speak, but also to keep sufficient surplus at home. The challenge we've had, I think, is that the bets we've taken on borrowing in huge sums haven't been tied to successful or effective strategies for the effective deployment of that debt. So, yes, the trade deficits are obviously an issue of concern, but the more fundamental question is investments in upgrading productive capacity that then can allow us to trade higher value products, capture more surplus from trade, and then meet the development imperative that many African countries still have. Thank you.
That's excellent. Trevor, why don't we turn to Margaret for a last word on this comment, and then we'll wrap up the panel.
Sure. It's hard to follow. I mean, I agree with so much of what has been said, but I mean, just to reiterate, I do think, I mean, whether we're talking about a deficit or we're talking about just the survivability, right, the sustainability of industrial productivity in certain regions, in certain countries, right, this is, I do believe, and I used this word before, right, there is something of an awakening happening in the Latin American context, at least, which is where I focus. That it's already been, a topic of discussion in other parts of the world that have been dramatically affected by this. But I think one other really critical distinguishing characteristic between U.S. growth and Chinese growth, and and beyond sort of the fact that trade was not as important an element of the U.S. growth story, is the scale of this, right? The scale of this is so immense, and the imperative for China is so, at this point, I mean, there's very, very little other option, right, other than to be able to export massive amounts of excess capacity, right, to largely the global south, right, in an effort to ensure that these industries survive, right, but also to continue to uphold them as those that are going to be promoting of China's economic growth and economic upgrading well into the future. And so, the scale is something unprecedented. And I don't believe that Latin American countries, I mean, frankly, everyone is dealing with this, right? So European questions everywhere. But all are beginning to realize that this is something that will need to be dealt with. China, too, is beginning to register this, right, and understanding that there may be some domestic political economy implications of these things, right, into the future, and already those are emerging. And so this is going to be the story to me of the next, year or so as we watch this play out.
I think that's an excellent place to end it, the story of the next few years. So please join me in thanking our panel.